Good evening, and welcome to One More Story Before 12, a true crime podcast that hopes to shed light on the events and cases left to linger in the darkness, those cases lost in the annals of time for reasons unknown, devoid of the notoriety encapsulated by their more media and public conscious relations. Crimes that, over time, have been left to gather dust. The following tale hopes to cast some light on these bizarre, fascinating, cruel, yet always intriguing events that led to the stories that I share with you now. Today's story is the continuation of The Beast of Jersey, a tale I first began recollecting a few weeks ago. I first focused on the crimes themselves and the unfortunate victims of the assaults. Afterwards, I spoke of the police work that was hampered by poor preparation and outdated laws, as well as an unfortunate scapegoat caught up in the middle of the ongoing attacks. In this video, I will finally tell of the man behind the mask, Edward Paisnel, and peel back the layers on a man with so many duplicitous characteristics. Just what sort of man could commit so many monstrous rapes, attacks, and even a possible murder, yet maintain a facade of meekness and gentility to those who knew him closest, including his own wife and children? Well then, I will tell you. I hope your drink is strong enough and you are bundled up warmly by the fire. So come closer to it. We have just enough time for one more story. One more story before 12. Just to keep us warm. Our tale resumes where we left off, the Isle of Jersey, a British crown dependency near the coast of Normandy, France. The Beast of Jersey, now known to us as Edward Paisnel, and what I shall be calling him from henceforth, had just been previously apprehended and was in police custody. Early on Sunday, July 11th, Inspector George Shuttler was called from his home to pursue the inquiries concerning a strange car thief. Though it was a routine inspection, Shuttler had a feeling they had finally ensnared the rapist that they had long sought after. It turned out that Paisnel had been one of the 13 men on the island of Jersey who refused to be fingerprinted by police. The main members of the team working with Shuttler were Detective Sergeant John William Frederick Marsh, known as Jim, and Detective Sergeant Colin Edward Lang, both of whom joined the Jersey Police in 1957, the year the first attack was reported. At that time, Shuttler was a police corporal, a rank that had long since been abolished. When members of the team questioned Paisnel, it seemed he had an explanation for everything. The wristbands, he stated, he wore for his own protection. Later he claimed they were for removing plaster from walls, an idea he was thinking of patenting. He also stated that he wore the jacket with nails in the shoulders for roofing jobs, as they gave a good grip on the rope which he slung on his shoulders for such work. On Monday, Jim Marsh and Colin Lang went to Paisnel's house and carefully observed and studied the one room in his house which served as his home and office. The wall farthest from the door had a big built-in bookcase filled with books on witchcraft, hypnotism, communism, judo, yoga, and the Isle itself. Along the bookcase was a white floor-to-ceiling cupboard with tall doors, and to the space right of it was a large curtain. As Jim Marsh pulled back the curtain, the detectives were shocked to discover that the alcove was lined with a thick felt to which was pinned a dagger with a long wooden blade. Beneath that was a glass chalice and a dish containing a plaster toad and some cloves. It resembled, at first glance, a shrine or an altar of sorts. Already feeling an uneasy feeling creep up on them, the detectives continued their search and soon discovered a small hole in the back of the cupboard, obscured originally by a roll of kitchen paper. Upon closer inspection, it resembled a keyhole that needed a circular key of sorts. As detectives pressed on the cupboard boards, they felt an air escaping through the cracks. After a thorough search failed to produce a key, the detectives began to force the opening, and after an hour they successfully pried the cupboard loose, swinging on oiled hinges. As it swung open, it revealed a secret room, 12 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 12 feet high. It was draped all over in brown colors, and there was an electrical light operated by a pull cord. There was a sickening, musty smell in the room, and apart from a wardrobe, there was no other furniture, save for a singular ladder. Peeking inside the wardrobe, detectives found a blue tracksuit with stains, later proven in court to be semen, and a pair of rubber boots, a cutout article from the Jersey Evening Post that featured a picture of one of the houses that Paisnel attacked, and a long raincoat with nails in the lapels. The same coat so often described by victims of the rapes. It seemed, at long last, that the police force finally ensnared the beast. But just who exactly was Edward Paisnel? What kind of a man could perpetrate crimes so vile and remain undetected and out of suspicion for so long? Few could believe that this gentle family man and respected worker could be a sex fiend that terrorized the Isle for years. Edward John Louis Paisnel was born in May 1925 and was by all accounts an intelligent, imaginative, and remarkably kind and sensitive man, according to the many who knew him. A jobbing builder and occasional gardener, he often worked hard for low prices and never pressed for payment, especially if he suspected the debtor was in a financial strain. Those who knew him often stated he displayed strong warmth and affection for children, an affection that would ring a close call with the methods of the beast, often accompanying children back to their beds, an almost perverse care and concern if the child was particularly young. Soon, however, odd recollections started to amass. Miss Brenda Le Breton remembered how one day she was in the woods when a man leapt on her from behind and knocked her to the ground. She struggled and managed to turn around, only to come face to face with Edward, or Ted as she called him, as did many others, Paisnel, whom she had known for years. Edward looked startled and exclaimed, "I didn't know it was you, Brenda," and then ran away without any explanation. She said, "I never mentioned it to the police," when she recalled the incident. "It seemed funny at first, and then I put it in the back of my mind and thought no more about it. I'd known Ted for years, and I didn't imagine for 1 minute that he could be the rapist. But, well, maybe I had a lucky escape." Paisnel was married to a woman named Joan, who incidentally wrote a book about the case herself, blaming homosexuality, of all things, as the cause of her husband's crimes and behaviors, who was incredibly shocked and seemingly unaware of her husband's behaviors. She deemed it a mistake, as Ted loved children, and although he had his eccentricities, he surely couldn't have led a Jekyll and Hyde existence. He would even irritate drivers by going 15 or 20 miles an hour on the Jersey Road, so the idea of him rip-roaring at 75 miles an hour in broad daylight through the narrow streets seemed preposterous. She later added, "Of course I didn't know that he stole cars and went driving around like a madman in the middle of the night with masks and funny clothes. So maybe I didn't really know the man at all." She simply couldn't believe that the man who would dress up as Santa Claus and delight children in the children's homes during the holidays would also dress up as a monster and stalk the Isle in search of victims. After all, Ted belonged to an honest and respectable Jersey farming family, all of whom were relatively humdrum, such as his father, old Emile John Louis Paisnel, who apparently was a huge influence on Paisnel growing up. Edward Paisnel, though he had numerous acquaintances, had few close friends, always preferring solitude and to mull over matters over his meditations. Growing up, he was a very good student and absorbed lessons and knowledge with relative ease. He would often daydream of his ancestors who hailed from Normandy and fought the English centuries ago on ancient battlefields. During the war, when England stopped any and all support to the Jersey Isles, a young Paisnel continued his fantasies of rebellion, and what may have started out as boyhood dreaming soon turned into an obsessive musing of sorts. He traced his lineage all the way to the days of William the Conqueror, and poured all his time into learning of various members of his clan and the stock they hailed from. During the war, he was forced, though some say he collaborated willingly, to work for the Germans, but he claimed he always did so he could steal food and other various necessities to distribute to the islanders and those in need. secret agent of sorts in his mind. After the war, and seemingly as all was returning to a state of everyday normalcy and routine, Paisnel started to become preoccupied with girls in an almost ravenous fashion. Before he was 20, he started an affair with a woman old enough to be his mother, and as it finished, as quickly as it began, he moved on to a Welsh girl named Joan Davies, aged 28. He married her on St. Valentine's Day in 1950, and they moved to South Wales where Paisnel worked in a quarry, and later in a mine. The marriage produced a child, a daughter, but not long after her birth, he hurt his back in a minor accident and decided to go back to Jersey. Joan, however, did not return with him, and in 1958 she successfully sued for divorce on grounds of desertion. By that point, however, Edward was working on his own account as a gardener and jobbing builder, living at his father's house at Boulevard des Parfums in the parish of Grouville, on the east side of the island. One night in mid-December, he was in a pub when he heard some people planning to go caroling to help a local children's home called Apprehension. He volunteered to help in any capacity and joined the carolers. After the singing, he stayed behind and asked Joan Walden, the daughter of the family running the home, if he could help in any way. Yes, she replied. They desperately needed someone to play the role of Father Christmas. Paisnel promptly agreed and dressed as Father Christmas, and gave out gifts on Christmas Day, even bringing his own personal presents, displaying Yuletide goodwill and a love of children. Edward Paisnel would continue doing this for a number of years, and as recently as 2008, victims of his rapes continued to come forth, claiming he would assault them as children during his visits during the holidays, and forcibly rape or commit other indecencies upon them. As the masquerade of a caring, loving man who sought to only ease the struggles of children was so marked into the views of many, and since no children at the time came forward, he would continue this deplorable act for many years. Over time, Edward developed a kinship with Joan Walden, herself the victim of an unhappy marriage that left her with 2 children. Over time, a mutual appreciation grew between them, as Joan looked upon Paisnel as a kind, gentle soul who was eager to help in any capacity, and who dearly loved children. True, he was rough around the edges, but what was a woman's role, she thought, if not to spruce up and polish his slightly uncouth manners? And so, in due time, they married quietly on July 1st, 1959, and Edward got to work on his small home, turning it into a proper household with an interestingly designed house with bedrooms, a big rambling kitchen, and a living room with an attractive wall. The other parts of the house, with its own entrances, served as an office for his business. Joan was impressed at his strength and the sheer patience and dedication of carving out a lovely home out of what was once essentially a rather squalid bachelor pad. Sexually, however, things weren't all that wonderful. Edward seemed disinterested in sex, almost at times fearful of her and her reactions, often calling her puritanical Joan, and treating her as if she were on a spiritual pedestal. When they did make love, it was infrequent and rather straightforward, lacking in the sex drive and imagination that Joan thought him capable of. Other oddities started to surface in due time. He would have violent outbursts of anger, in which he swore terribly and would smash things. When their mutual daughter was born, and it became apparent the child was physically handicapped, he flew into a rage, ranting how a curse was put on the family, and that there would be no more sons born to the Paisnels because for centuries men in the family had been rapists. One day, she accidentally let some hens out of their run, and they ate some of the seeds he had just planted in the garden. Paisnel threw a rock at her with such force that had his aim been slightly better, the rock would have maimed her. So appalled and disturbed by this incident was Joan that she no longer shared a bed or table with Edward, who preferred to eat alone anyway, and although they lived under the same roof, Ted decided to live in the room he used as an office. The sham continued in front of the people of the island, as no one suspected that behind the mask of a happy marriage were 2 tumultuous individuals, who, although living under one roof, shared neither bed nor table. Over time, the oddities began to pile on even more. Edward began to study the life of the French nobleman and reported serial killer, Gilles de Rais, claiming he had a spiritual connection with the man he deemed his ancestor based on his studies. Rumored to have slaughtered over 1,000 children in violent acts of debauchery, de Rais is a controversial figure, seen either by most contemporaries as a dupe and political obstacle that needed to be dealt with by the 15th century church, or a small-time offender whose crimes were exaggerated to remove him as a political opponent and lay claim to his bountiful land. As Gilles de Rais was in love with Joan of Arc, herself famously burned at the stake, this strengthened the rather tenuous connection in Paisnel's mind over their similarities. He began to dabble in the black arts, as de Rais was rumored to have employed the works of an alchemist called Prelati to summon a demon named Baron to do his bidding. The shrine found in his closet may indeed have been an attempt to recreate one of these ritualistic masses. One of the oddest yet highly disturbing occurrences took place one night at the household, when Joan was awakened with groans and muffled gasps of what sounded like a man struggling with the heavy object. She lay still in her bed, listening to the sounds, then ran to the window exclaiming, "Is that you, Ted? Whatever are you doing?" There was no answer, and the heavy breathing stopped. Joan put on her dressing gown, ran downstairs, and opened the door. It was pitch black, the darkness enshrouding everything. Fearing an intruder might be on the loose, she returned with her terrier Timmy by her side. The dog behaved strangely, refusing to lunge forward or even attack, and remained deathly silent at all times, not even faintly barking or growling, staying by her ankles. As her eyes accustomed to the darkness, she realized that she was alone, no man in sight. As she lowered her gaze on the grass of the garden, she saw a horrifying thing. In front of her was the chicken wire cage where the children kept their guinea pigs, and Skippy, their pet rabbit. There was a hole torn in the side of the cage, and all the animals were viciously slaughtered, quite literally torn limb from limb. She called Edward from his room, and together they cleaned up the lugubrious mess from the grass, before the children would have a chance to see it in the morning. Paisnel claimed it must have been a dog or some other rabid animal, even showing an article clipping from the Jersey Evening Post that wild polecats on the island had been known to attack chickens and other various small animals. He fervently seemed adamant that a polecat was responsible for the carnage, and Joan accepted the explanation, as not for a single moment did it ever cross her mind, or did she even suspect that her husband had anything to do with it. Other islanders weren't so sure, and many found it impossible to swallow the notion that an animal as small as a polecat could have torn such a hole in the chicken wire cage. When the police came to the house some years prior in regards to fingerprinting everyone on the island, Paisnel refused, of course, and Joan and the police seemed satisfied with his explanations at the time. A couple of years later, when the attacks were still increasing, the police came knocking at his door again. But when questioned where he had been the previous night, Edward said that he had simply stayed home. When his wife probed into the matter, knowing that he had been out, he said that he went poaching, and that he only said that he hadn't been out because he was afraid of risking arrest or public embarrassment. Again, the police and Joan seemed satisfied by these two different explanations, and no further inquiries were made. In 1968, Paisnel met Florence Hawkins, a woman of 43 who had a slim, dark figure, and who worked at a children's home run by Joan's family. Over time, the budding friendship began with both parties merely exchanging pleasantries, then moved on to small talk and finally open conversation, especially about their failed love lives, as Paisnel was unhappy in his second marriage and Florence was still a virgin. Eventually, an affair flourished between the two. They would often meet in secret for long walks along the cliffs or in the countryside. When she eventually took a job as a nursing auxiliary at Jersey General Hospital, She always had Sundays off and would spend them with Paisnel at her house in St. Helier, making love and enjoying the dinner she would cook for them. Edward would often tell her of his interest in the occult and witchcraft, and would give long lectures on the subject, even letting her borrow a book called The Satanic Mass. However, let us return, after this brief and summarized look into the man that Edward Paisnel was, back towards the criminal investigation that we left off from. The committal proceedings were about to begin against Edward Paisnel, and the full story of the 21 cases of assault, rape, and sodomy would be unveiled for all to see. The proceedings were to be held in the assembly room of the town hall instead of the ordinary magistrate's court, since the public gallery in the normal courtroom was too small to cope with the expected big crowd of spectators. The relief police court magistrate, Jurad R.E.B. Voisin, was in charge. Centenier Goodsman was prosecuting, and advocate T.A. Dory appeared for the defense. There was a ban on newspaper reports of the proceedings, so those who didn't manage to get into the public gallery had to rely on recollection, rumor, and speculation, of which there was plenty to go around. Paisnel was brought from the small police station into the town hall building, wearing a blue sweater, and was led into the room where the proceedings would unfold. The case opened with evidence of arrest by two centeniers, and then P.C. John Riseborough described the chase on the night Paisnel was captured, claiming that he drove like a madman, and when caught said 2 or 3 times that he did not want to involve anyone, which they thought was quite strange. Detective Constable Barry Charles Simpson told of his talk with Paisnel, who explained that he had been to a meeting of a secret society, which accounted for the strange clothes he was wearing. Advocate Dory asked, "Did you have any knowledge of witchcraft in Jersey before this?" "I have never had any information of these societies," answered the detective. "Then it could be a figment of Paisnel's imagination, no more than a fantasy in his mind," suggested the advocate. Detective Sergeant Jim Marsh told the court that among the things found in Paisnel's car was a raffia cross, and when this was shown to Paisnel in prison, he was startled. "His face went bright red," said the witness. "His eyes bulged and he chuckled in a strange way. He then said, 'My masters would laugh long and loud at this.'" The sergeant asked Paisnel if he was afraid of the cross, and he replied, "Not particularly. There is a much more powerful emblem than that. Our cocoon is getting larger. Your world is shrinking." When charged with the first sex offenses, Paisnel said, "Write them out and I'll take them all." A few minutes later, he added, "I'll take them all since the occupation. It's up to you." The first evidence of an actual attack came from a 12-year-old boy, a good-looking, fair-haired child who recounted how he was snatched from his bed and later sexually assaulted by the prisoner. Mr. R.A. Davies, the state of Jersey analyst, said he examined the sperm found on the boy after the attack and compared it with the stains on Paisnel's raincoat. They matched. Another teenage boy said he had often seen a man loitering near the house when the attack took place. The man wore a blue tracksuit and seemed to be watching the house. The boy was frightened by the man, and he thumbed a lift to get past him. He identified Paisnel as that man. Inspector George Shuttler said Paisnel denied that the hidden room at his home was a secret. Questioned about the strange clothes in the wardrobe, the accused replied cryptically, "My little friends have been interfered with by the people who interfere with us." Paisnel also claimed that at the time of his arrest he was drugged with tranquilizers. He told Mr. Shuttler that he was in bed with Florence Hawkins at the time of one of the alleged attacks, that he slept there every Saturday night. He had claimed that the stains on his coat were caused when he had sexual intercourse in his car. When evidence was being given about the books on black magic found at his home, the accused shouted, "I am being persecuted because of my beliefs." Numerous inquiries into various assaults were made, statements taken down from an astonishing number of sources. Some of the cases seemed linked directly to Paisnel, such as his sperm testing positive. Others, due to lack of proper cataloging, had to be dismissed, if only for the fact that certain elements didn't tie together. Height, description, voice. Finally, the the magistrate Edward Paisnel addressed the court. The time has now come when the public should be made aware of this case, and I see no reasons why what has just been said should not be reported. Edward Paisnel ruled that on all charges the police had brought some evidence which should be heard by the royal court sitting without a jury. It was not for the police court, he said, to decide whether evidence was right or wrong. And so the case went to trial in its entirety, Paisnel and his counsel agreeing to a trial without a jury. There were only 13 items on the charge sheet, 8 fewer than in the lower court. Some of the motoring offenses had been eliminated, and the charges made by an air hostess, the only victim to make a positive identification of Paisnel, were also dropped, even though she recognized him clearly when the interior light of the car came on as she kicked open the door to escape. The strongest of all the cases against Paisnel was dropped with no explanation, despite claims the identification may have had an unfair effect as far as the other charges were concerned. The trial began on November 22, 1971, and Mr. Krill read the charges. 1. Attempting to commit the crime of sodomy with an 11-year-old boy during the early hours of August 9, 1970, in a field at Vallée de Vaux. 2. On the same occasion, indecently assaulting the boy. 3. Committing a grave and criminal assault on a 15-year-old girl at about 11:45 p.m. near Trinity Manor on August 6, 1966. 4. Committing the crime of rape on the same girl and 30 minutes later. 5. Attempting to commit the crime of sodomy on a 10-year-old girl at about 2:15 a.m. on July 19, 1964, in a field at August Trinity. 6. On the same occasion, indecently assaulting the girl. 7. Committing the crime of sodomy with a 16-year-old boy at about 2:15 a.m. in a field at Grouville on August 3, 1964. 8. On the same occasion, committing a grave and criminal assault on the said boy. 9. Criminally breaking into and entering a house at St. Martin on March 27, 1960 at about 12:45 a.m. and assaulting a married woman. 10. In the same house, committing a grave and criminal assault on the woman's 14-year-old daughter. 11. Committing the crime of rape on the said girl in a field near the house. 12. Attempting to commit the crime of sodomy with a 9-year-old boy at about 1 a.m. on April 19, 1963, in a changing hut in a field near St. Xavier. 13. On the same occasion, indecently assaulting the boy. Advocate Dory entered a plea of not guilty on all counts. The Attorney General reminded the court that on November 9th an order had been made prohibiting the publication of any particulars or the taking of photographs of any of the children under the age of 20 in accordance with the Island Children's Act. He asked the press to respect the identity of those who were underage at the time of the assault, but were over 20 now. The bailiff ruled that publication of such names was prohibited. After a long trial, with various pieces of evidence presented by numerous parties, from semen samples to recollections of various articles of clothing, a consistent, if slightly jumbled and cut-up picture of events was forming, and it took the Jurats only 38 minutes to find Paisnel guilty of all charges, and he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. If any good came of Paisnel's crimes, is that it finally sparked a complete reorganization of the Jersey police structure, one that wouldn't be hampered by a laissez-faire attitude and antiquated and useless laws. As for Paisnel himself, later when his appeal was dismissed on September 6, 1972, he was escorted out of the courtroom screaming, "I was framed by the bloody lot of you, by Shuttler and you," managing to kick Marsh in the shins and still shouting in his holding cell. Paisnel went first to Wormwood Scrubs, London, then was transferred to Winchester to serve the bulk of his sentence. On July 13, 1991, Edward Paisnel was released. Little was known of what happened to him behind bars. Rumors swirled around that he was said to have inspired terror in his fellow prisoners. Even the notorious Cray brothers, also in the prison, were said to have been in awe and fear of him. However, there is no confirmable evidence of this. 2 years before his release, he married his third wife, Florence Hawkins, as Joan had previously divorced him, and when he was let out, he returned briefly to Jersey with his bride. Such was the hostility of the islanders, however, that he was forced to go to the Isle of Wight with Florence at the age of 66. He lived on Marlborough Road, Ventnor, with his new wife, until dying of an apparent heart attack on Thursday, July 29th, 1994, at his home. Paisnel wished to be buried in the family grave at Grouville, but his sister, the head of the family and legal owner of the graves, objected. A separate plot was denied in fear of local hostility and grave desecration. Eventually, on the orders of the Isle of Wight coroner, the body was cremated. His widow refused to divulge what became of the ashes. Thus ends the story of the Beast of Jersey and of Edward Paisnel. 3 books were of utmost importance in helping me. The Beast of Jersey, written by his ex-wife Joan Paisnel, The Jersey Monster by Ronald Maxwell, and finally The Untimely Silence by Ward Rutherford. Unfortunately, all of these books are long out of print and fetch quite high prices on the online market. I would recommend A-Books or eBay to pick up a used copy, if you're lucky. I also have to thank North Edinburgh Nightmares for their help in locating some photos, as well as recollections and pictures of the Isle of Wight. Thank you so much. Your input greatly helped me out. Check out their Instagram and their website. They divulge some fascinating writings and stories of the darker side of Edinburgh. I also thank you, the listener, for staying so patiently and listening to this tale, reaching its final crescendo with a bit of flair, I hope. You are quite brave. Who knows what future stories I'll tell soon. Well, the fire is dying out. Shall we end for now? Until next time, I await to see you all by the fire for another story. One more story before 12.